So welcome. We encourage you to continue eating as you listen to our cadet presentations. And so it's my honor to introduce our very first cadet presenter. This is Cadet Ashley Clegg of the Military Academy at West Point. Cadet Clegg is a senior and so is about to complete her studies at West Point and join the Army proper. And Cadet Clegg is going to be presenting on the legality of high energy lasers in space interactions. Cadet Clegg, welcome.
Good morning. My name is Ashley Clegg. I'm a senior at West Point and I'm a law major as well. So first, we'll go through the agenda and talk about the various slides I'll have for us today. First is the overarching research questions. We'll have the main one up front and then go into a little bit more detail of what we're talking about. They'll then move to the use of force, armed conflicts, and we'll end with a comparison against cyberspace and cyber law. So this image right here is kind of where our project started. It is a depiction of when the Russia-Ukraine conflict started. This is a satellite image of troops moving into Ukraine. Although Russia was claiming that it was not moving at that time, so this is showing that this imagery has the capability to show the terrain, the movements, troops, etc., and can show it to your adversaries. With that, the question then becomes, can we use a piece of technology to prevent this imagery from occurring? So the overarching question that we've been wrestling with this research is, can we use a high energy laser on an imaging satellite? And will that constitute a use of force or an armed attack? For our research questions, there's a couple of things that we've been wrestling with to understand. This will lay the foundation and be a stepping stone for others to take and move forward with research. First, we want to look at the effects that can be caused. When using a laser on a satellite, there's a spectrum of effects that can occur, anywhere from reversible to irreversible effects. So it's a two-part question to understand what are the technological effects that can occur, what level of energies do we need to use in order to produce a certain effect. On the same note, there's the legal realm and understanding what impact do these effects have and what are the legal implications. Another thing that we looked at as well is with the increasing amount of commercial satellites being used for military purposes, are they targetable when they are producing these images like in the false flag? So a big thing to understand is the importance of the research. It goes much farther than just a senior law major at West Point. There's many cadets at the academy working on this project that are in different majors, bringing different perspectives. We also had the pleasure of having General Karbler come and explain what is the reason why we're doing this research and why is it important to do so. We aren't necessarily looking for the answer as cadets, but we are trying to put the stepping stones down to provide more information and the direction some may go. The first thing that I started to look at was the use of force. The document that my eyes first went to was the Outer Space Treaty. And one thing I found interesting was there was very absolute language on national appropriation and prohibiting that. But with that, I thought, well, maybe there will be absolute language on the use of force or the threshold or something that would help give some guidance on what could be used and lawfully used. But there was not. It was unaddressed. And this is where some of the controversies came in trying to understand what is permissible versus what is not. The next thing that we started to look at is that most interferences with satellites, more specifically imaging satellites, is below the traditional threshold. For example, if you have a kinetic act, most of the times the effects come from physical damage or loss of life. Those things, when you are using a laser against an imaging satellite, may not occur. Therefore, we're trying to understand what is the room between that and how can we respond if it doesn't fall the way traditionally a kinetic attack would. The next thing that I looked into was, does the classification of the conflict, either a non-international armed conflict or an international armed conflict, play a difference in the classification of use of force? One thing that I thought was interesting was that the sporadic satellite interference when in a non-international armed conflict, meaning two states are not already conducting hostilities, it takes a lot more to meet that threshold than it traditionally would. For example, if most of the satellite interferences that occur via high energy lasers, they're very sporadic, they don't reach a high threshold, and they wouldn't have the same effects of a kinetic attack, then how do we deal and respond with that attack specifically? The biggest piece of the project was trying to understand where can we find information that would root a parallel for this research. One thing was we looked at maritime law and principles and trying to understand, would that be a good comparison for this specifically? But we then realized cyberspace and cyber law and principles would probably be more applicable due to the fact that they both, space law and cyber law, lack in some of the areas that we were looking at. With that, we had the pleasure in a couple of my law classes, Professor Mike Schmidt coming to our class and speaking on the Talon Manual, the international experts that came together to make the Talon Manual, and some of the principles that were critical in understanding the level of threat some cyber attacks could potentially pose. Some of those principles include severity, immediacy, directness, and measurability. The two that stood out the most to me in comparing them to space law was severity. With that, you are uncertain of how a laser could potentially affect a satellite, whether you use the same energy, but the satellite is different. It's an older model, or there's multiple payloads, or there's different aspects that could lead to different effects. With that, the severity of the same action from the laser could potentially cause a higher level of threat than otherwise. On the same note, a cyber attack could do the same thing. The severity is on a spectrum. You never know completely what the effects will occur and whether or not the satellite will be able to resume its full function as it once did. The next thing that we looked at was, it is very hard to distinguish between the temporary and the permanent level of damage. Same thing as irreversible versus reversible. To understand what impacts could occur, some may think about the high energy laser when it's used on the satellite. Some of the pixels in the actual imaging and camera may die off, which would make the image less clear. That may not seem like a huge difference in being interfered with, but in the long run, it could have drastic impacts. The next thing to understand with severity is that satellites are tied to infrastructural things with a state. So it doesn't stop when you attack the satellite in space. It's very much connected to things outside of that in every domain. So the severity can very much add on the more domains that impact the action that was just taken upon that satellite. With our research still continuing, it's been about a 2-year process with lots of cadets and research, different majors, going to different conferences. Our goal was never to find the answer to these questions. Our goal is to provide the stepping stones for international experts and providing just direction. So some of the relevant questions that we're still looking at are, what are the parameters for understanding what is going to lead us to decide, can I use this high energy laser on this satellite? What are the different ROEs that we need to think about? Trying to ignite some thought process in the direction that we need to move forward to. This could potentially be very critical in the Army of 2030, and it's something that we definitely need to think about. Lastly, I would like to thank the SMDC. I'd like to thank the Payne Department, the Physics and Nuclear Engineering, more specifically Colonel Harkey, I'd like to thank Dr. Nasu in the Law Department of West Point, and I'd like to thank everyone who allowed me to speak today. That concludes my brief, pending any questions.
Thank you, Cadet Clegg. We will now proceed with our cadet presentations. Our next speaker is Cadet First Class Cristian Montelongo. Cadet Montelongo is from Cadet Squadron 12, and he is going to be presenting on targeting distinctions between commercial and military assets, something that is obviously of especially deep concern as the continuing Russian conflict in Ukraine continues. So welcome, Cadet Montelongo.
All right, perfect. So as said before, I am Cadet Cristian Montelongo, and I'll be talking about targeting distinctions between commercial and military assets. So first off, this is kind of the agenda I'm going to be going through. First off, I'm going to go through the background of why this topic is even coming up, some of the issues that are providing this conversation to be held, a couple potential solutions that are very broad in concept, since I do not feel like I have the expertise in law to be able to make specific policies, and then my personal recommendation on what I found and potential issues to that recommendation. So kind of the background is the rules of war and how rules of conflict have been evolving over time. Ever since conflict has occurred, there have been different rules for every single domain, whether it's the ground domain, the air domain, you name it. This is because we want to minimize the amount of effect we have on the civilian side. We want to make sure our civilians are protected, and only those participating in the conflict are going to be the ones that are affected by war the most. And now we have it, so it's branching out to the space domain, where we're starting to think about what can we do to ensure that our civilian and commercial sectors do not get affected by a huge amount by our capabilities. So one of the things that first came up was the conception of the space domain, and how when it was first thought about, it was looked at as a supporting domain. Whenever space was first thought about, we didn't have as much technology as we do now. And at first we thought it mainly be used for communications, things like that. And the concept of having attacking capabilities was a far-fetched scientific thing that we didn't think would be possible. But now, as space has been evolving over time, we are now looking at the presence of attacking capabilities and how the space domain has evolved past the supporting role. Excuse me. So another concept is the increased presence of commercial satellites in the space domain. Over these past couple of years, we have seen a lot of commercial sectors really delve into the space domain. So much, in fact, that they are overtaking the military in amount of capabilities they have in space. And as more and more space capabilities are taken over by commercial assets, we're also seeing a blend between the military and commercial sectors. And it's creating this gray area of what is a military asset truly and what's a commercial asset truly? How do we distinguish between them? Another concept that's been brought up is the fact that each satellite has the capability to have multi-functions. These multi-functions makes it very difficult to know exactly what each satellite is doing. A satellite may be sent up and it's told that it's going to be used for image satellites, ISR, position navigation, but it could have a secondary function that we do not know about. And that could be potentially dangerous to all of our other capabilities. And so really making sure we understand that is integral to this question. So the question really is, what qualifies as a targetable asset? And the best way I can bring it up is the situation in Ukraine right now, where SpaceX is providing a lot of capabilities to Ukraine to help out in that aid. And the question is, does that make SpaceX and Starlink as a whole targetable for Russia and other adversaries? Does them helping in a military sense immediately qualify them to be attacked? And one of the biggest reasons we care is because we have to be able to present ways to attack our own adversaries. The US is seen as a global superpower. And so any action we take in space will be mimicked by other smaller countries, and our adversaries will look about it with under a microscope and try to find holes in what we do and say, that was illegal, that was never defined, why you're doing this in the space domain. So kind of the flip side of that is our adversaries as well can attack our commercial satellites and say, well, really, there's never been any rule set. Why aren't we allowed to do this? They can just try to do as much as they can to be as confusing as possible and really set different norms that we do not like as the US. And one of the biggest things that I'm afraid of is the critical satellites that support our civilian sector. They have no official protection. There is nothing stopping China from just attacking our commercial satellites because there is no rules in place saying you can't. Theoretically there are, but there has never been any permanently written stuff that allows us not to be attacked. Okay, so one of the different topics I was thinking about is how do we attack this in a way that we can really make sure the norms of space are what the US intends. So potential topic I thought about is having the commercial sector really be off limits completely unless there is a tangible perceived threats by our adversary. So kind of a requirement for a perceived threat is that it provides significant military gain for the adversary or for ourselves. So what I mean by this is, let's say you have an image satellite that is taking pictures of our assets, and it's really supporting a different role for a lateral attack against us. That to me is a significant military use of a satellite, and it oversteps the commercial use of that asset. And because it oversteps, I think it now qualifies as a military asset instead of just being purely used for commercial satellites. Another big thing is if there was just the perceived threat, any adversary could just say, I perceive this as a threat, I perceive this as a threat. So I believe a community board would be really important to make sure that every single attack has evidence behind it and ensures that they are not just wrongful attacks. And if there is found to be wrongful attacks by another country, having monetary compensation for the destruction of the commercial satellite and the effects on the commercial sector because of the loss of that satellite. Another idea I had, which is my second policy, is stricter registration rules for commercial satellites. So whenever we launch up a satellite, there are different registration processes we have to follow. And I believe one of the best ways to distinguish between what is a commercial and military asset is doing it before it even launches into space. And this can be done through many different ways. I think one of the best ways is, since there's so many confusions or so many different questions when it comes to satellites in space, having commercial satellites give up a bit of their secrecy whenever they are launched by explaining their functions, explaining what they're capable of doing, having the host organization be transparent on who is using these satellites, really having that agreement almost as a legality thing will ensure that every single commercial satellite is being used for its intended purpose, and that's the commercial sector and civilian sector. And if there is a breach in that contract, then that will be converted to a military asset. This is a bit different from my first COA, as there is written rules for each commercial satellite that if they are broken, it immediately qualifies that commercial satellite as a military asset. This ensures that there's no confusion of what is a perceived threat. There is no confusion on whether or not there was enough military gain. There is specific rules that are set out. And if they're for a military asset, it can be registered as normal. It can keep a lot of its secrecy, keep some of that multi-function capabilities to ensure that other adversaries do not just get an unfair advantage on us. This is very broad and kind of makes the situation seem a little bit too easy, but just all satellites in general are targetable. This does not matter if it's a commercial sector, military sector, and personally, I do not think this is the best idea. However, it is one that we shouldn't roll out completely. Having every single satellite be completely targetable ensures that there is no confusion on what can be targetable. This makes sure that escalation of war, escalation of conflict does not get confused in the weeds. Our adversaries cannot come at us saying that this was unfair of you attacking this. This is the amount of loss we had in the commercial sector, or them saying that against us. It really ensures that there is no abuse of the commercial sector, since everything is fair game once it gets launched into space. After doing a lot of research on this, I recommend the stricter registration rules for commercial satellites. I believe knowing what is a commercial satellite and what is a military satellite before it's even launched in space really helps ensure that we are tracking what can be targetable. And having this distinction can really help the United States know what plans to take whenever our adversaries do something, and knowing how to respond when our adversaries try to do an attack against us. I think it tackles the issue of commercial satellites being protected, and there is no assumptions going to be left on the table. However, when doing this research, I also understood there are potential issues to this plan. One of them is that commercial satellites can almost be used as a barrier for themselves. So a commercial satellite could be used and said, I launched this commercial satellite and it remains untouchable until it does something that's for military gain. Well, let's say, why don't I just attach an attack capability on that satellite? It's considered commercial, it's not going to be attacked, and then they do a multilateral attack on all of our satellites. They have that protection of the commercial sector to ensure that we wouldn't have been able to attack them before they did that attack us. Another possibility is with the increase of cyber presence in space, hacking can be done on our satellites and falsify a commercial satellite to do something that is for military gain. And because of that falsification, that now commercial satellite is considered a military asset, even when it was not intended to do that and was from an outside source. So these are potential issues I see with this recommendation, and it will take further research and further ironing out of the plan to ensure that commercial satellites are not being abused for that purpose of military assets. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Cadet Montelongo. Wonderful presentation. Our final cadet presentation, kind of for the pre-conference cadet presentations, is going to be presented by Cadet First Class Mikayla Howell. Cadet Howell is a cadet from Cadet Squadron 31, and I will welcome her to the stage now. Cadet Howell, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see me over the podium. I'm a little short. I am C1C Mikayla Howell, and today I'm talking more about the what we should do versus what we can or can't do on the issue of space debris removal. Okay, so a quick overview with what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to give you my bottom line up front, or my bluff, on the policy that I recommend for actually taking action to decrease the amount of debris in space. I am going to give you a brief background on the issue at hand, so specifically space debris in orbit today, and then the current policies we see in the international arena. I'm going to give you the 3 policy options that I personally researched, and then I'm going to give you my policy recommendation. So I'm sure you can all read the slide, but for kicks, I'll also read it to you. My bluff is that the best policy to reduce space debris is to have governments incentivize commercial companies to lead the research and experimentation. So I'm sure many of you are wondering how I came to that conclusion, and I first started by looking at the background of the issue. So in space today, we notice the increasing importance and use of space for military operations in day-to-day life. So by a show of hands, who had to use their GPS to find their way here today? Exactly. You wouldn't be able to get very far without GPS and therefore space. Additionally, when we're looking at the debris in space today, we're noticing a concerning trend of the amount of debris actually increasing. And the reason we care about this is because even a piece of debris the size of a paint chip could be catastrophic to satellites or assets that we have in orbit. And a little tidbit that I found very concerning was that the Space Surveillance Network is currently tracking over 500,000 marble-sized pieces of space debris in orbit today. That's not accounting for the hundreds of thousands, millions of those paint-sized chips that could damage or destroy your assets. Additionally, I'm sure many of you in the audience have heard about the 3 C's that often characterize space. So contested, congested, and competitive. And in the context of space debris, I'm really looking at how that limits the accessibility of space and how that reduces the usability of space. When I did my research on the current policies, and I'll admit it's a bit of a generalization, but the trend I noticed was that most nations, including the US, tend to focus on mitigation rather than active space debris removal. In fact, a lot of the passive methods are only trying to mitigate the increase of space debris, but not actually reduce the amount there. In the US, the Federal Communications Commission recently changed the deorbit time for satellites that have completed their mission from 25 years to 5 years. And this is a good step in the right direction. But again, this is a passive method that is only going to limit the increase of space debris. But if we want to continue using space for centuries to come, we need to actively reduce the debris we see in orbit today. So the policy options that I personally researched were to promote collective action, incentivize private industry, or to continue the current path. So for the promote collective action portion, I broke that down into 3 steps of who has the responsibility, how it's going to be achieved, and then the feasibility. So for the for the responsibility, I noticed the general trend that any space capable nation who has assets in space has contributed in some way to the debris present, whether that be testing capabilities like the Chinese 2007 ASAT, launches in general where stages of the launches might not re-enter into Earth's atmosphere, or just old or dead satellites that are still orbiting. All nations who are in space have played a part in space debris. Therefore, for this COA, all nations should be responsible for trying to actively decrease the amount of debris. So how this could be achieved is either by mandating it or creating new norms. For mandating it, we could have the UN push an international resolution that mandates space capable nations have a hand in reducing the amount of debris. And for setting a new norm, we could have someone, probably the US, due to historical cases, step up and start the process and start that trend of actually trying to remove space debris. Now, this sounds nice, but there are a lot of issues with this COA, mainly that resolutions passed by the UN are not binding. So it'd be very difficult to actually enforce that resolution and to hold countries accountable. And then the time to pass a resolution can also be significant, which would result in lost time for research and development and actually trying to reduce space debris. For the norm, it would be hard to get buy-in from other countries because not all countries might perceive this issue as an issue, or they might not think it's their responsibility. So this code would be nice if it worked because it would spread the burden evenly throughout all the nations who are in space, and it would have countries work together. Now, I'm sure you all know that this is my preferred COA, and I'll try not to sound too biased when I talk about it. But for incentivizing private industry, I broke it down into the government limitations versus commercial freedoms, the how and feasibility. So for government limitations, the main one that I noticed was the politics of blame that governments often face. So in this context, that is where people tend to blame their government for things that go wrong or things that aren't to their liking. And it really makes it hard for the government to assume risk because they won't have the support of the people. Additionally, governments tend to face financial constraints that can also limit their ability to assume risk and to put money towards a new or ongoing project. And then governments often have other priorities that significantly limit their ability to take on a new project or to contribute significantly to a project that is already ongoing. On the commercial side, while it's not completely free, they do have more freedom in funding, as you often see private funding with commercial companies, for example, Elon Musk and his Starlink constellation. Additionally, they do not face the same threat of being blamed that governments do because they do not have that obligation to their people. And they have more mission choice freedom because of it, which has fewer limits on what they can do, the risk they can assume, and how they can accomplish it. So how the governments could incentivize the private industry, the main ones I looked into were economic compensation or social compensation. So economic compensation could come in the form of cash grants or other means, and this is feasible because it has been done in the past. And then for social compensation, the government could legitimize or promote these companies in order to give them better business prospects in the future. So while this one it sounds good, and there are some good aspects to it, there is a big issue that we could run into. But before I get to the issue, I'm going to talk about the good parts of this. One would be that government agencies are already contracting out missions to commercial companies. And for this topic in particular, the European Space Agency is actually currently planning a space debris removal mission called ClearSat-1 that is led by a commercial company. So as you can see, there are already commercial companies who are starting to tackle this issue. So if we can get it to be more widespread, then that would be reasonable and a good step in the right direction. Additionally, having the commercial companies lead the charge would allow for more risk-taking, freedom of operations, freedom of funding, and time. There are fewer immediate funding concerns since it is privately funded. The potential issue that I ran into, however, is the concept of indemnification, which is where the government would be liable to owe compensation to these commercial companies for any risk or loss that they encountered during the process. So the way that I was looking into trying potential ways to combat this would be with contracts or promising compensation beforehand, getting all the agreements out in the open before any risk or loss is undergone. And at the end of the day, however, you can never truly avoid all risk. So my final option is to continue the current path. So this would really focus on mitigation and then the feasibility of this. So mitigation to continue with the current policy would just be attempting to mitigate the increase of space debris and the number of collisions on orbit today. And this is reasonable because it has worked so far. For example, the ISS, if given enough time, is able to maneuver out of harm's way. This could eventually escalate into a collective action problem, much like global warming has in recent years, which could force countries to act later down the line when their assets are put at risk. However, I think this is the least feasible option because this just pushes the problem to be handled in the future and it doesn't make any forward progress on it. So we would have lost time for research, lost time for development, lost time for testing, and we could lose countless assets if we keep waiting. As General Brown said, we have to accelerate change or lose, and this is the exact type of situation he was referring to. So as I'm sure many of you have guessed, my recommendation is to incentivize private industry. And the main reasons why is it's the most feasible, it has the most freedom for time, and there are already current projects in place that are addressing this issue. So it is reasonable to think that we could expand it to a larger international scale. So in conclusion, I gave you my bottom line up front for which policy option I recommend. I gave you a background on the issue of space debris and the current policies we see in the international arena. I presented my 3 policy options, and then I gave you my recommendation that the government should incentivize commercial companies to lead the charge. Do you have any questions?
Mikayla, we do have a couple of questions from online. First question, Mikayla, is how can we use the Outer Space Treaty and other, kind of national laws like the Orbits Act to create an international legal framework for on-orbit servicing and the recycling of space debris? Do you have any thoughts or opinions on that?
Yeah, so I had not looked into the Outer Space Treaty, but I think we could use that for sort of the guidelines that it sets and also the norms that it puts forward, and we could use that and try to adapt it to our situation. But again, that could be timely, but it is a potential, another COA that we could pursue.
Awesome. And then a quick follow-up question. So we heard from Cadet Montelongo just a few moments ago on targeting of satellites and those sorts of things. So we have an online attendee who is asking, how do you protect commercial satellites from attack and interference? I know that you're mostly speaking about space debris, but any thoughts on that issue?
So the question is, how can we protect commercial satellites from any sort of targeting or attacks? All right, I think Cristian could speak better to this than I can, but
So based on what we've been seeing in space, I think the #1 way, in my opinion, that we can prevent commercial satellites from being attacked is setting some healthy norms that ensure the commercial sector stays separate from the military sector. The issue I think that I tried to brief is how do you ensure that that distinction is clear and visible and ensure that those norms stay in place?
I second that.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our cadet presentations for this morning. It is about 08:36. Our main program is going to start at 0900.